I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. And today I am speaking with Michel Wattiaux, who is a professor of animal and dairy science at UW-Madison, where I also teach. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So it's nice to see you. You're under a beautiful wood beam roof in a lovely wooden room.
My basement.
We are spending lots of time in our basements. Is everyone healthy in your household?
Yes. We had a little alert 2 days ago, and we ended up getting tested for COVID, but thanks God, the test came back negative right this morning.
Good, congratulations, that's wonderful. So let's start with a little bit of your history. You're Belgian originally, and you somehow made your way from Belgium to Madison.
That's correct.
Tell us about that.
Well, I was born and grew up on a dairy farm from a pretty relatively poor background, a large family. I'm one of six, and I'm the first generation to college. And I went to college in part because I really wanted to help the farm become successful. And one thing leading to another, I had the opportunity. My first job was a teaching assistant at the university where I graduated, and
in Belgium.
In Belgium, correct. And I work because of a family situation. After finishing college in Belgium, I actually went back and worked on the farm as a first generation to college. I didn't have a clue what to do with my degree. So, and as I said, because of a family situation, I went back on the farm to work there a couple years, and then got this job at the university as a teaching assistant. And that kind of was the beginning of the whole story of opening the doors to possibilities for a PhD in the US after going to a conference. And so I did my homework. I tried to find the scholarship for me to come here. I worked very hard on practicing my English, and I started applying to a whole bunch of universities because I was told that's what you do. And I was lucky enough to be accepted here at the UW-Madison, and I arrived here in 1985 at the age of 23 or 24 and never left. So
that was to get a PhD here or to get your first job here?
It was to get the PhD. Yes.
And then you went straight from there on to the faculty at the same school?
Not exactly. I have a whole series of stories from the PhD. So I came to start my PhD in 1985 and never really had the intention to stay here until I had one of my lab instructor who basically caught me, and this is how we ended up getting married. So the big question a year or two down the road was, am I going to take my American wife back to Europe and have her live like an immigrant in Europe, or have me stay here and develop my career here and be the immigrant in this country? And I guess, by now, by default, what the decision has been. So right after the PhD, freshly married, and I kind of looked for a job around the country and interviewed, but my wife was in the physician assistant program, which is a brand new program at the university at the time. So I was not very flexible, at the same time as I was applying for a job. It was like, well, but we cannot really leave Madison because, she's still at school. And so I got a series of postdocs. And then I had a job with an institute that was called the Babcock Institute for International Dairy Research and Development. And for 10 years, I was basically doing what we call at the university extension work, but with an international audience on dairy. And so that was really a God-given opportunity for me to travel a lot and to have a really worldwide understanding of the field of interest of mine. Having grown up on a farm, having gotten a PhD in the field, that, you know, I grew up in and was passionate with. And now I had the opportunity to understand this from a very worldwide perspective. That was a wonderful opportunity, you know, and professional and development growth time of my life and career. And then in 2000 is when I applied for the job that I have now as a faculty. So and I came back in the department that I graduated from, you know, 12 years earlier. Mm-hmm.
That's fun. As you know, but so our viewers may not know, we hold very dear at this university the Wisconsin idea, as it's known, which is that the work that we do here is not done with the purpose of staying within the ivory tower, but with the purpose of serving the entire population of the state. And we are a land grant university created largely to serve, I mean, this is the dairy state, so we are serving the needs of the state. And it seems that you are at the vortex of that.
That's one way to put it. Exactly. Yes. And it has, you know, honestly created some tension because I mean, the reality of the world in which we live in at the university, right? We need to being able to demonstrate that we are serving first and foremost, you know, our countrymen, you know, and in my case, it's, you know, the Wisconsin dairy industry primarily. I continue to argue that, you know, it's only by broadening the boundaries of what we are, you know, thinking as being inclusive of understanding issues that others have, for example, that we can better find our way forward here. So sometimes I do feel that although there is this, you know, Wisconsin idea that I feel very strong about, I'm one of the people who are always at the edge of trying to push the boundaries a little further in terms of, you know, not, you know, challenging the parochial attitude that oftentimes we fall back when things become a little scary, or, you know, we feel insecure or something like this.
So let's take one step backward for a second, and then let's advance back to the point you just made. Animal and dairy science. I grew up in Massachusetts and had most of my professional life in New York City, where animal and dairy science was not a big deal. And I suspect that most of the people watching this are not terribly familiar with dairy science. So what do you do? What do you study? What is this field?
So the field of animal and dairy science deals primarily with the raising of farm animal that contribute to food supply in the human chain, right? We are not all vegetarian. Vegetarian or vegan don't rely on animal product. But the reality is that when you look at economic development around the world, the very poor people cannot afford to include animal product in their diets. But when income rises across economic status in societies, then one of the very first things that parents will do is provide their kids with an animal product source, an ice cream, right? Get some cheese, you know, you know, in the household if you can afford it. And so we in animal and dairy science are scientists who are studying the farm animal species that include primarily poultry, swine, beef, and dairy animals. So dairy cows and you know, there are different breeds within those species of animals. And so we are concerned about how to raise them, how to feed them, how to guarantee that they reproduce, right? This is, right, herds of animals, flocks of animals that give birth to babies, and then you have to raise those babies to become adults so that the cow can produce milk. I sometimes compare a dairy farm, this may be a surprise to your audience. I compared a dairy farm to a maternity ward. we have, you know, we want to collect the milk, and to collect the milk, the cows have to give birth, and therefore, you know, you cannot get, you know, closer to anthropomorphic idea of what a dairy farm is than thinking about that that way. And so, as I said, feeding, reproduction, management, there's a lot of effort in more recent years on animal welfare issues, right? Make sure that those animals live in a relatively comfortable settings and are not stressed by the environment in which we put them. But in essence, that's what we do. We don't deal with the processing of the milk or the processing of the meat. We just do the raising of the animals on farms. And typically the food sciences department around the country will take care of dealing with the product that comes out of the farm and its processing and packaging, and maybe, you know, the safety issues, all that is different departments.
So you may not be able to answer my number one burning question, which is organic milk versus non-organic milk, grass-fed beef versus regular old beef. Can you talk about those at all?
Oh, well, I can speak to this to a certain degree. Because I do actually, in my teaching now that I've done this job for 20 years, expanded, as I said earlier, always pushing the boundaries, expanded the boundaries of my teaching. And I actually teach a course now called Food Systems and Sustainability. And actually, it's one of the case study that I engage my student in is comparing organic milk production in the state of Wisconsin relative to conventional milk production in the state of Wisconsin when it comes to environmental impact and in particular greenhouse gas emission. And my answer, honestly, is it all depends. I'm sorry, but it all depends.
You're a true academic.
Now, it all depends because let me explain a couple of things briefly. Number one, we as a scientific community have been extremely good at developing the tools to go deeper and deeper and deeper into a narrowing and narrowing and narrowing field of knowledge. And it's only in the very recent history of humankind, literally, and in particular with climate change in particular, that all of a sudden we realized that we didn't have the tool to understand systems as a whole at the larger and larger and larger scales, including all, you know, in the case of climate change, planetary level. When one of my students recently asked me, Michel, you are the environmental person, you know, in our department. What do you think of climate change? And I said, you are a scientist, aren't you? He said, well, I'm trying to become a scientist. I said, how many replicates can we have to study climate change at this planetary level? We cannot do an experiment with climate change to find out the control and the non-control, you know, issues. So I think we really need to think differently, right, about you know, science and, you know, answering all of our questions. There are things that you need to go with based on your value. And now I'm going back to answering your question about organic versus conventional. The science in terms of environmental impact, and in particular greenhouse gas emission, there is no difference between organic and conventional. Now, there are many other aspects, environmental aspects, where you can argue that one is the winner and the other one is the loser, or you take another set of criteria and now the first one is the winner and the other one is the loser. So it comes to what I think social scientists, and I'm not a social scientist, but I guess I keep my mind open to try to listen and learn from others. I think they call this a wicked problem. A problem that doesn't have a standard analytical solution, because the solution to the problem depends on taking into account the values that people bring in as stakeholders. And so if you are a believer in organic production because you believe that animals are better treated and is better for the environment. And, you know, microbes in the soils are happier microbes than in a field of corn and alfalfa or corn and soybean. Go for it. You know, I buy milk, organic milk, or I mean, organic dairy product in general, or sometimes I don't personally. So I really think that it's a matter of choice and value of the consumer. And I don't think the science, you can interpret the science in the way that will support your point of view that you may have to begin with.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you've whacked a piñata and there's just questions flying every which way. So you brought up the topic of climate change, and you brought up the topic of the narrow focus of science, at least in America, probably around the world as it's studied now. So you're not in science, presumably you're not studying the behavior of grazing cattle, but some particular chromosome in, you know, in some particular part of the animal, and it's very, very tiny and incredible depth in this very narrow area. And it strikes me as ironic, you started your career in the extension division where you're basically advising farmers. You're right in the middle of systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious whether your field has been able to expand to consider systems. And I'll let you talk about that as regards advising farmers through the science that you practice, but also as regards adapting farms to the new climate that we're finding ourselves in, and potentially adapting to the pandemic. And I recognize that maybe that will let you talk for the rest of our interview, because that's a lot of question all packed into. I gathered a whole bunch of questions off the floor and I'm putting them together, and
Sure.
I give them to you as you wish to answer.
Okay, so wow. So let me try to organize my thought for a second here. Well, a year and a half ago, my dean in the College of Ag and Life Science asked me to become an interim director of a center called the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems. And this center is actually pretty unique in the sense that they are trying, our staff is trying to work at the system level with the farming community, but also, you know, the entire food chain. So we have some scientists in our center working with, you know, farm to institution linkages, you know. So we also look at the consumer side and things like that. I think that I've seen both in my own department. It's very difficult, I think, for departments to go away from the treadmill, the scientific treadmill of, you know, we hire new faculty because they're young, enthusiastic, very bright, and they're going to go and get money from the funding agencies who themselves have a very biased, right, sets of goals and objectives. And that's, again, going in that direction of deeper and deeper in a narrower and narrower field of science. But as I said, at the same time, we have a center like the Center for Integrated Agricultural System trying to work with producers, not just to tell them what they should do, but to better understand the struggle they are facing. You know, for example, one of the main struggle in many farms in Wisconsin is less technological issues and more human needs, you know, healthcare issues, right? So many farmers have a farm household, have a household member, the wife or the husband, working outside for the only purpose of bringing healthcare to the family.
That's fascinating, because when I think of the farm, I think of the animals and the crops that are growing, yeah, but it's a human community as well.
Exactly.
With the same human struggles that everyone's having, or maybe worse, because farming, family farming is presumably not the most lucrative business.
It is not. It is not. And I think what's, you know, in my utopian view of the future, and I think one of the fundamental issues that we have in this country, and the integration help address this issue, is that we in America believe that when something is good, more of it is always better.
That's the American way.
That's the American way. And how do we build in those rail or those mechanisms that at some point send the signal that, okay, that's enough. You don't want to go further. Stop now, because you're really becoming more, you know, destructive than constructive by pushing, you know, always more is better. And I'm coming back because you mentioned I could go in any direction here. It ties with one of the questions that you had, which is a lot of the problems that agriculture is faced with today is actually in part the results of the way our science has developed over the last, you know, 150 years. And I'm saying 150 years, it may be 160 or some, because I'm referring back to the creation of the land grant system by Abraham Lincoln, the land grant systems, where each state received a piece of land to start doing research to help the economic development of the states, primarily through agricultural production. And that system has worked wonderfully, you know, for 150, 160 years, no question about that. But because we haven't taken care of the whole system, now we're dealing with what fell in between the cracks. And animal welfare is a good example. Water quality concerns is a good example. And air, you know, contamination, whether it's through greenhouse gases or ammonia emission from livestock operations, are a very good example of, you know, pushing the boundaries of what we could do to the point where all of a sudden we realize, hey, wait, we are really having a big impact. That, you know, we thought we were good steward of the land and good steward of the natural resources. And then all of a sudden now we say, society is telling us that farmers are polluters. I mean, a lot of people are getting pretty upset about that. Yeah.
I was going to ask about cattle and their farts, their methane. Is this just a myth, or is this in fact true that there's just tremendous amount of greenhouse gases being farted into the atmosphere by our dairy farms?
So, okay, so just now relying just on the science, and you just hit on the question that I, you know, particularly, I do research in and at the discipline level, but also try to bring this at the system level. So there were a few scientific papers published in the last, you know, decades on, so the milk carbon footprint, and let me try to put things a little bit in perspective for you and your audience. And there are a few points I want to make here. Number one, yes, the most of the emission that is associated with you taking a glass of milk in the morning, or, you know, putting milk in your cereal, most of the emission associated with that is emission that occur on the farm. It doesn't occur in the processing or the consumption or, you know, the disposal of the waste. And on the farm, it is true that most of the emission is associated with the methane that the cow produces. Now, just for your audience to be straight about this, it's not through the fart, it's actually through the breath.
Really?
Yes. Talk about misconception here. So when you see
the
big
wrong
flame,
end completely.
yeah, when you see big flames, you know, icons in the web, and you search cow and methane, and you see big flame coming out the rear end of the animal, it's scientifically wrong. There may be 1 or 2%, well, maybe at most 5% of the methane that comes out that end, but 95% of the methane coming out of the animal come out the front end through the breath.
Is that a byproduct of processes in the rumen?
Exactly. You know enough about nutrition physiology to understand that. Yes, it's rumen microbes that actually are the microbes that help the ruminant be very unique because they can use feed resources that we human beings would not be able to use and transform them into high value animal product for us.
So we are certainly not grass-fed.
We are not grass fed, exactly. We would actually, if you want to lose weight, go and eat grass. Wouldn't give that advice to anyone, but you understand what I'm saying with that. Okay, so yes, methane is a major contributor to the carbon footprint of milk and dairy product. That was the first idea. However, and this is a point that I try to get my student to consider. You hear an awful lot of press, right, about take animal agriculture, take radical action against animal agriculture. And my concern with that is animal agriculture has a role to play in society. There's no question about that. It's, again, finding that balance that I was mentioning earlier. Where is the correct balance, the appropriate balance for animal agriculture to be part of a society where we truly build on the benefits of ruminant animals? You know, they produce fertilizers that are very valuable for, you know, the soil. Much better fertilizer than chemical fertilizer that are produced, you know, through extractive, you know, processes. So this is just one of the many examples of animal agriculture contributing positively to society at large. But now let me finish my thoughts here with another consideration for everyone. There's been a lot of debate since an FAO report released in 2008, that's when I think it was first released, was called Livestock Long Shadows. And that was the first report that, you know, a lot of the media latched on about, livestock agriculture worldwide has a huge impact on environment. There's been a lot of additional work since then. And even in the very best or the very worst, depending how you think of it, case scenario, agriculture contribute 20 to 25% of all the greenhouse gases worldwide. Now, I'm just focusing on greenhouse gases only, 25%. And so people say, well, if you want to reduce greenhouse gas, stop eating meat. Where are the other 75% of greenhouse gas coming from?
Trucking that meat?
Driving around, burning fossil fuel in combustion engine. That's where most of the remaining greenhouse gases come. It comes from the oil that we buy from Saudi Arabia or wherever, or, you know, from what we extract from this very own soil of this very country, and then we burn back into the atmosphere as CO2. But try to put in perspective how many times you've heard, you know, stop eating meat versus how many times you've heard, try to drive less, try to fly less, get on your bike. It's actually going to be healthy for you, right? Yeah. So you see the perspective there? Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we've just been through 2 weeks of 90-degree temperatures. I know that weather is not climate, but the climate does seem to be changing. I was very nervous moving to Wisconsin in 2011 because of the winters. And this is purely anecdotal, but they're not so bad. And people tell me about winters of the past, and it really does seem like the climate is changing. How is that affecting farmers?
It affects farmers in multiple ways, good ways and bad ways. Because the winter in Wisconsin is becoming milder, I think it's a fact. And I think what is happening is that the minimal low temperature in the nights of the winter in particular don't drop as low as it used to be. So my understanding of the trends in Wisconsin in terms of temperatures is that it's not as much an increase in the high. It doesn't get as hotter, as it used to be, but it doesn't get as cold. That's basically what we are experiencing in Wisconsin. What it means for farmers is maybe a good thing, is that their season can start a little earlier and can extend a little further at the end of the season, which would make growing crops more productive, which would be, theoretically a good thing for Wisconsin farmers. On the negative side, however, climate change is also climate variability, right? And so the severity of the storm and the risk associated with losing crops, due to weather events, is really increasing very sharply. Floods taking, crops out of the field and rushing them into the river is things that's going to happen more and more. So, and dealing with that variability is inherently one of the main and historical difficulty of being a farmer, because farmers, as opposed to a manufacturer of, TVs or cars or your cell phone, the farmers deal with biology every single day of their life, whether it's biology of their animals, biology of the crops, and biology of the microbes that lives in the soils or in the rumen of the cow, or the pathogens that makes the cow get sick. So managing that biology is in essence what farmers are doing, and climate change will cause all sorts of weird things happening in that biology. And so it's going to make agriculture more unpredictable, which is not a good thing, because that needs to be somehow transformed or accounted for in price setting, right? If you're not sure of the supply, well, then that will have an impact on prices.
Right. Do you have cross-departmental relationships with atmospheric sciences, or do you have people directly involved with climate change in your own animal and dairy science department?
Not directly. Well, no. Interesting enough, actually, it's a colleague in the soil science department whom I believe had some contact with people in atmospheric science. And this colleague was the principal investigator on a grant that looked at mitigating greenhouse gas emission from dairy systems in the Great Lake regions a few years ago. And I believe that with the results of that project, which tried to quantify how by changing some on-farm practices, we could possibly reduce greenhouse gas emission associated with milk production. I think he took those results and talked to someone in atmospheric science to see if they could model these changes on the impact on climate, using the climate that the atmospheric scientists have developed. So yes, we have communicated with one another, but not directly my department, and another colleague in another department. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Those walls are high and steep, I know, but it seems like in a changing world, we have a lot to learn from the people in the next building over, and hopefully change will come.
Definitely. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So climate change was my first disaster question. My second disaster question is population. I recognize we're in a pandemic, but generally speaking, the population is going up. We're up well over 7 billion now. Can we feed all these people, and can we do it without destroying the earth?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. It almost gave me the shiver. Oh, man. So I remember going to conferences of agriculturalists, which unfortunately increasingly has been dominated or sponsored by large international corporation. And so this idea that how will we be feeding 9 billion people in 2050, was such a biased perspective. So my perspective is, and my response when this came up to a conference, I went up to the microphone and I said something along the lines that Asia needs to feed Asia. Africa needs to feed Africa. The US needs to feed the US, and Costa Rica needs to feed Costa Rica. And I think this is the grand challenges of agriculture. And, this is why I'm still passionate about my job, is to make people realize that when it comes to feeding the world, one size fit all doesn't work. And as you very well know, in science, sometimes it's not as much what's the answer, but what's the right question. And I think this is a perfect example where science has been hijacked by corporation interest. You see what I mean?
Because the international food corporations want to feed the whole world.
They want to have a world market, right? And it's not sustainable. It's not good for the future of the planet. If you think that just because America Midwest, has a lot of land and can produce a lot of food, that we should just pretend that we can feed the world, and that, people in Africa don't have to worry about their agriculture because we're going to provide them with think of the political implication of this. And, it's so ridiculous. And yet so many people believe in this kind of, and in all their hearts, that, we are the American exceptionalism, right? It's completely wrong, right? So, and to me, this is what I'm very excited about. And, I'm getting it towards the end of my career here, but I really am at the point of thinking of a third sabbatical that I want to take in the next couple of years. And it has exactly this theme behind it. How can I contribute to making people understand that, yes, we need to have those global ideas. The work that the FAO is doing, the World Food Organization, is fantastic work, but the solution need to be local. So think global, act local. And how do we build resilient food systems at the local level? Given the natural environment, the type of soil, the type of climate, what kind of food, crops and food should we be producing? And I think if we take that approach, yes, we could easily feed 9 billion people without destroying the planet. But the question still remain, is 9 billion people too many people on our planet?
That's a good question, but one we maybe won't address today. But I do wonder, I love the idealism behind this notion of taking care of our problems locally, well, maybe while helping each other as well. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So my question is that, just looking at the United States, feeding the United States now, is that compatible with capitalism?
Very good question. Probably not. And it goes back with that idea of a good thing, if something is good, let's do more of it. So we can produce milk very cheaply in Wisconsin because, we know how to do it. Our cows like cold climate. They're very, efficient. So then people will argue, well, why promote the production of milk in Mexico if they can buy it from us cheaply, and they don't have to go through the struggle of developing an industry in a less favorable type of environment. Ag Econ 101, which says, right, that those who have an advantage should be producing for the rest of us and we exchange. I believe to this principle. Trade is a good thing worldwide from country to country. There's no question about that. We don't want to be 160, island trying to be self-sufficient. But again, there is that limit, of a good thing becoming a bad thing when you push it too far. And I don't think that too many international organizations are really trying to think very hard about how do we find mechanism, or what are the tools that will send us the signal when we are going too far. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if we do continue build on that idealism, we will be solving the poverty level, the poverty in around the world, and we will be solving and addressing a lot of the sustainable development goals that the United Nations has, challenged all of us to contribute to. Because a lot of the poor people, and paradoxically, around the world, a lot of the poor people are people who live in small piece of land, who basically are farmers, but they are unfortunately living at the subsistence level outside of the market economy, the capitalistic systems that is the predominant model for human activity today. So again, I think, and we know it, capitalism doesn't address all the needs of human needs. It needs to be controlled, managed, and restrained. And I don't think we're doing a good job of that in this country in these days.
Okay, and disaster question number 3. This is the final disaster question, I think. What about the effect of the COVID pandemic on farming communities, on the food supply around the country and around the world? Are you seeing anything yet? Are people looking at this? Or are we still in the period where we're just trying to keep ourselves and our families safe and make it through the summer?
So, well, I think taking it from this may be the question I'm the least comfortable to address, because it's so
new, I know.
So new, yes. But going with what you hear in the news media, if you are a farmer living in the countryside, live on the countryside, and I grew up on a dairy farm in Belgium, so I can bring that perspective in here. You live pretty isolated from other people, right? And you live in open air. I mean, the first thing a farmer do is in the morning is get up and go outside, right? In cities, we're all indoors all the time, and we are congregating. So clearly, I could understand why rural community questions, wearing a mask and not getting together. I mean, I understand that. So that's in terms of the skepticism that can come from some rural community about the recommendation that we have. Now, going back to the mass production of animal product, right? You've heard some hotspot associated with workers in processing plants, slaughter, and again, this is associated, right, primarily with minorities working in those facilities, right? Low pay, wage, workers. So I think the COVID-19 has impacted. It demonstrated, again, the fragility of our food systems. And again, in my view, thanks to nature, a cow when the cow produces milk, you cannot make the cow stop producing milk. The cow will continue to produce milk, for a whole year until it taper off. When you planted your crop, COVID or no COVID, the crop will continue to grow until you have to harvest it, right? So those are not where the issues are. The issues, again, is the people involved in providing the commodities and providing the raw product to the processors, then right, convert it and process it into product that you buy in the market. And I think this is where most of the impact is really going to be from. I don't really believe that COVID-19 will have any very fundamental impact on the production of food in the country, but it's going to be more, again, how that food and the justice associated, right, and who's going to get sick and die in the process of bringing that food to your table. Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating that, when I started talking to you, I really knew nothing about dairy science, and now I'm seeing that your field is related to climate change, it's related to economics, it's related to sociology, microbiology. You're really such a clearinghouse of different fields coming together.
Well, Yeah, yes. Remember, you don't have any degrees of freedom here. You just interviewed me today. I got, now that we are a new department as of July 1st, 24, 25 colleagues. We all have our own views about those issues, right? You know, in the spectrum of thinking globally, I think I'm probably, you know, pretty, you know, far in terms of, again, thinking globally as opposed to thinking narrowly. I do have a number of my colleagues who are not concerned about those issues. They're just concerned about, you know, cow health, cow welfare, you know, and that's enough for them. And
Which
that's
is
okay.
important too, right?
Yes,
No.
yes, yes, yeah. Yeah, and I guess, you know, this is one of the things that I really enjoyed, as you know, working at the university such as Madison here, pretty competitive place. Um, you know, I am very grateful that, you know, the department I got my PhD in 30 years ago is the department where I've been able to develop my career. Um, basically being able to pursue some of my own interest, you know, which may not all the time 100% overlap with, you know, the narrow view of, you know, you're in the dairy science department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, you should be working for the dairy industry of the Wisconsin dairy, you know, of Wisconsin. And
You're working for the good of humanity.
yes, definitely.
Final
Definitely.
question.
Mm-hmm.
Is your family farm still in your family?
I do have a brother who's still the operator of the farm where I grew up. Yes. He's 10 years younger than I am, and he has actually upgraded the farm facilities about 5-6 years ago, and is, I think, overall doing pretty well. Yes.
That's great news. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I hope that somehow I can learn about music and how it contributes to the welfare of the world too.
Well, that can happen anytime. Thank you.
You're welcome.